Let's see if this is better. Much better.
Hey, welcome to another. Good start.
Good start. Try two. Take two. Let's go.
Hey, welcome to another episode of the WP Crowd. Sorry we weren't around last week, but I was at LoopConf with a bunch of WordPress developers, and we didn't have a chance to record anything. Today we have a cool episode, and I'm hoping it'll lead to some great conversations. But before we start, I'm going to do some intros here. So, Carl, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Carl Alexander. I'm a PHP dev. I speak at a lot of WordCamps, and I write on a website called The Man in the Arena. You can find it at carlalexander.ca.
And if you were at LoopConf with me and you got a sticker and you were like, who the F is this dude on the sticker? The sticker is a sticker of a cardboard cutout of Carl. So connection.
That's a WP Crowd sponsored, and
yes, a WP Crowd sponsored cutout of Carl that we turn into a sticker. That is what that sticker is. I'm hoping that if you did see you were at LoopConf and you were wondering who the hell Carl was, you now know. Also on today we have Nick Adams.
Hi, I'm Nick Adams. I'm founder and lead dev at Revolt Media, and I have in fact brought said Carl cardboard cutout full size across the U.S.-Canadian border twice, and so far not been stopped. So it's a winning streak, if you ask me.
So just so that if you weren't aware, Nick is WP Crowd's official mule. And our
mule now.
Yes, he does bring our stuff across the border, and we appreciate his services in that. No matter where he puts Carl board for it to remain hidden. So today we're talking about WordPress. I know, big surprise, but I think the last podcast that was on was about coffee. So it's good to be back to normal.
We
WP
actually did a podcast on coffee.
Yeah, our last episode was just about coffee. It's actually pretty good.
Was it just Josh talking the whole time?
Josh Norcross and Chris Flanagan. You should really watch these episodes, man. Like, I don't feel like I should be selling this to you. You should just be watching, or at least know what's happening. So we're back on WordPress, and the question I wanted to answer, or really it's kind of a fill in the blank. The question, or the fill in the blank I posed to everyone was, if WordPress was rebuilt, I'd want blank. And I feel like we have a good mix of people here. I being an enterprise level developer, Carl being a developer on the highest level, and Nick being an amazing consultant and WordPress user.
Also, you covering the JavaScript side.
Yeah, and I can cover the JavaScript side as well. The question I want to answer first, and this could be like a whole topic in itself, but I'm going to try to limit it to about 5 minutes here. Do you guys think that in whatever form, if WordPress was rebuilt, right? Because it said if WordPress was rebuilt, backwards compatibility, do you think it needs to be a thing? And because during LoopConf, I actually sat at a table with Josh K of Pantheon. He's the co-founder. He was actually really big in the Drupal community and still is big in the Drupal community. Pantheon as a host, great host, not our sponsor in any regards, but I still like him. Pantheon started out as a Drupal host and then came into the WordPress space. We had a great talk with him. And one thing he told me, which I actually not sure if I knew already, or I knew Drupal 8 wasn't backwards compatible with 7. One thing I didn't know, I think, was every single major release of Drupal isn't backwards compatible with the previous version. So 5 isn't compatible with 4, 6, 5, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
So do you think WordPress needs to do that? Like if WordPress, let's say we're talking WordPress version 10, right? WordPress still manages to stick around. We're not version 10. Do you think there's a point where backwards compatibility shouldn't be a thing, and maybe it shouldn't be a thing today? Like, what are your thoughts on that before we get into what you actually want to see out of it?
Well, one of the confusing thing I should preface, like, the whole WordPress version numbers mean absolutely nothing compared to what most devs are used to. Like most devs hear a version number, they think semantic versioning. WordPress does not use that. When you're using WordPress 4.7, you're really using WordPress version 47. And in that respect, I think that confuses a lot of devs that come from other backgrounds, but I think I think one of the strong aspects of WordPress is the backwards compatibility. So I don't think that removing backwards compatibility is really a good decision per se, because then you're not any different from anybody else. Like it's not a distinctive factor. I think that's one of the distinctive things of WordPress is that they're like backwards compatibility no matter what. And I think that's important in some aspects, but obviously if taken too far, it can be detrimental to the growth of the platform itself.
How about you, Nick? From your point of view, do you think backwards compatibility is something you would need out of WordPress forever, like to consistently be backwards compatible?
Yeah, I think Carl had a lot of great points there. And when he said it can be taken too far, I think to some degree WordPress has taken it too far. I mean, I love WordPress. I think there's a lot of great things about it, but I mean, trying to keep people, up like all fine when they're using like a version that was like 2 years ago, which is happening. I mean, they're still running like security patches on versions, like major versions that came out way long ago, and I'm seeing all this stuff going on, and I feel like there's just too much of an emphasis on that, and I think it holds some parts back. I think at some point you've got to, if you're running a site and it's useful or worth to you anything, people need to start taking responsibility as the user and realize that they need to be keeping their stuff up to date. You can't rely on very old plugins, very old themes, and therefore have to have an old version of WordPress, because there's a lot more that you're missing out on. I mean, entire things that just aren't available in older versions. And so I think at some point they need to cut it off, and I think they're doing it a little too late.
There's one thing I'm still thinking about, and it actually goes back to Carl and I talking to Tom McFarlane on our podcast, I think 2-3 weeks ago. And not Tom, but Carl brought up the fact that there are projects out there like what is Ubuntu, which have like long-term
LTS, long-term support releases.
Yeah, so I feel like backwards compatibility keeps WordPress in one linear timeline, right? So like my version of WordPress is on the same timeline as the same, 3 more versions from now. So let's say version 4.9, whatever. It's the same exact timeline as 3.x, right? Or 2.x for that matter. The one thing I never thought about, if you took the LTS strategy and then you took the Drupal major release strategy, where if they went from 4 to, like we went from 4 to 5, and said, okay, if you're on 5, you're no longer, your WordPress site that's 4 is no longer going to be supported, or no longer it's not backwards compatible to 4. But we kept, because the community is as large as it is, kept security updates and bug fixes for, coming out over the span of, let's say, another 5 years. So, right, like if 4.x turns into 5 and we say 5 is no longer backwards compatible with 4, but you're still going to get updates and security patches and everything to 4 from the community for like the next 2 to 3 years, right? Until and that's how that's how everything works, right? PHP does that too. PHP 5. Every version has an end of life cycle, and before it becomes end of life, before they no longer support it, there's a few good chunks of years that are just there for security patches, and that's it.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is philosophically, they're more interested in doing something along the lines of Chrome, which is like auto updates. Like, ideally, even major versions I'm sure eventually they would like if major versions updated as well automatically. And that's where the aspect of backwards compatibility comes from, because if you're going to auto update people's sites to keep them secure, you better not break them.
Well, yeah, but again, if the auto update was smart enough to say, hey, don't do a major, like if they're on WordPress 4, that's that's a container they're in, right? Therefore, only security releases to 4 might be auto updated. And to be honest, most people that are above small business level, right? They don't auto update anyway. Most SMBs and mid-level and big corporations don't auto update. They turn that off specifically because
Yeah, I mean, I would like it better that way. I think there's something to be said too, that people are lazy and they're just not going to update. And the combination of LTS plus auto updates really fits, I think, really well in that, because you can arrive, like Nick can arrive to his client and be, okay, I'm going to put you, like the last LTS version of WordPress was 4.7, and I'm going to put you on that. And he knows that for the next 3 years, he's going to get that site is going to get automatic security patches, and he doesn't have to go back, make sure that the code's updated, deal with the clients that don't want to pay to update the site and keep it secure. There's definitely, I think, something to be said with this kind of combined approach. I think you need the auto update. Like the auto update to me is critical. But I think the LTS fits really well also in this, in the sense that as a consultant, I mean, even for you, for enterprise, like I've done enterprise consulting too. Like it's just the client doesn't want to update their site. Like they're like, this is stable. But if you tell them, well, you're vulnerable, like for example, that REST API vulnerability this week, this is critical, like if you were on 4.7.0 and you were like, the client doesn't want to move, then you're done.
Yeah, and it produces a lot of friction. And so I think auto updates what I'm saying, I agree with all of that. I think that again, if in terms of backwards compatibility, I think it's great, but I think there needs to be silos for it. And that would benefit a lot. Also help out WordPress. Josh K again from Pantheon gave a great talk as a keynote to start out LoopConf. He talked about how WordPress kind of moves into the enterprise realm. Not that it's not there already, but how it continues to push into the enterprise realm, especially when competing with other products, from Adobe and stuff like that. And that's one of them. I think that's one solution that could help enterprise feel more secure and mitigate a lot of the risk that is involved with WordPress. If you said, hey, you're going to have version 4, right? Not even 4.7, just you're going to have version 4, and you're constantly going to get security updates to it until you're ready to refactor and rebuild your site in 6 or 7, whatever it might be. Basically taking the Drupal method without being Drupal, I guess. So I want to move on. So let's talk about actually what you would actually want if WordPress was rebuilt. So let's make the assumption version 10 is basically a new iteration of WordPress. Again, we're three types of developers here. We do 3 different things. Nick, from the consulting point of view, I'm curious, what do you find WordPress would need, and what would benefit you if WordPress was rebuilt, basically like in the near future?
Man, so I think one of the things that's really missing, that's most needed, and there's always a workaround, I think it would be better if it's built in, is better control over user roles and capabilities. Right now, you either have to do some custom coding or use a plugin, and as we all know, like especially like the WordPress ecosystem with plugins can be unreliable at times. Developers can take the money and then sell you a license and then disappear and say that they couldn't make it work, therefore they're done. And I think it would have been great if that was built in. Interestingly, one of the things that I really wanted to see from a user perspective for quite a while has actually just yesterday been announced. They're calling it Gutenberg, and it's more of a front end editing. So a total redo of the WordPress editor. And I think plugins like Visual Composer for a while was doing that well. I think they got a little too excited about what they could do and started to think of like just because we can do it, should we do it? They forgot to ask that question. But I think plugins like Beaver Builder have done it well. And obviously those are not made with the developer in mind. A lot of us like to custom code our own entire pages with templates and advanced custom fields or our own custom fields, anything like that. We like to do that, but from the end user, the default editor just has not cut it for quite a long time. And so I'm glad to see it. That's actually been picked up.
Are you talking about the WYSIWYG, like the text editor, or like the actual like editing the website from the front end?
So this is the text editor. They just announced yesterday. It's called Project Gutenberg, and it's somewhat along the lines of like a really basic version of like Beaver Builder, pretty much just a page content builder that's front end instead. And I think we're gonna hear. I mean, it's just gaining traction like today as that news is breaking and people are realizing that this is a thing that's being proposed for core. And so I think we're gonna see more things come of it. Like if you go to the WordPress GitHub right now, the first thing you're going to see on the very top is Gutenberg. And so that already could be one of those things that I was ready to talk about today that might actually be coming true, right before our eyes.
Carl, from a developer point of view, me and you could talk a lot, and we did kind of before the show about the future of WordPress and it as a platform.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think very often about rewriting it, just because I feel like it's a bit of a dead horse at this point. Like you have Ghost and you have like all these, you always have a CMS that's like, oh, like Laravel has a CMS, Symfony has a CMS. Like every major framework comes out with a CMS and they're like, we're going to be WordPress. And it's like, you don't quite understand like the appeal of WordPress. Like it's not as simple as just rebuilding it. But I really like the conversation that the pre-podcast conversation, which I will bring up. Ryan McHugh did this talk at LoopConf called Next Generation WordPress, talking about how to upgrade WordPress. Like how do you go with something that's over 10 years old and make it better, or bring up like the level of coding standards in it without breaking some of the fundamental aspects or philosophies of it. And I think that's the much more interesting conversation to have, is just how do we get through the next 10 years? I have a feeling that most people think it's just going to be all JavaScript, but I think it's a bit simplistic to think that. Like it's just you're going to need a back end either way. So it's all good, but if you put a Porsche, if you put the chassis of a Porsche on top of just a Tata, well, it's still a Tata underneath. So you need to kind of up the engine too. So that's important. And I think that's a much more productive and interesting discussion. Like, what are the strategies to have? And that's what Ryan talks about. But I think that's more important to me as a developer, is what can we do to bring up the coding standards of WordPress, what it can do, and what it can bring to developers without going and breaking everything philosophically that it stands for, especially backwards compatibility. So that's, to me, the more interesting discussion. and one that Ryan started and one that I've started multiple times as well. I would just like them to just, if I had to pick something, we talked about it, but it's just pick a line in the sand. Decide where backwards compatibility ends and starts, and let developers know where this happens, so that we can decide, okay, well, we can rewrite parts of what's going on behind it without having to worry that core is going to be like, no, you can't do that.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation, and one that, developers that I've been, in circles of, as well as Carl himself and I have had, not just, in the past week, but in the past years, talking about creating wrappers and basically rebuilding without losing the backwards compatibility of the functionality. So, while one function exists, like WP insert post, not losing the fact that that function does what it does, but have it being powered by something much more robust. And then if a developer knows what they're doing, they could actually bypass something like that altogether. There's some fundamental parts of core that, could be rebuilt, but if they were just rebuilt without any kind of haphazardly, you would break, a good portion of all WordPress sites, because you have to really, really test it and make sure that everything that exists from, for the 10 years WordPress has been around, some of those legacy functions, make sure that they still work, because you never know what is going to break on someone's website, and that might break enough websites where, that's going to be a real issue. So moving into it as a platform and how to get there, highly recommend it. I'll link in the description below to Ryan McHugh's talk from LoopConf this past week. Great talk. And it might give a better idea of what we're talking about, of how to do all this whole thing. And I love to see that. From a JavaScript point of view, Carl said, people assume everything's moving towards JavaScript. And while that appeals to me as a JavaScript developer and fanboy, 2 weeks ago, I had Josh on. It was just Josh and me talking about PHP, and how, while we all want to learn JavaScript and how everyone's talking about JavaScript, business logic, when you're using the API, still needs to be written in PHP. It's actually what I'm talking about in WordCamp San Diego in March. So if you happen to be there, please come check out my talk. But yeah, there's no way that JavaScript's going to take over the whole WordPress ecosystem, because kind of the smart way of doing things, when you have an application you want to build on top of WordPress, business logic still should remain in PHP, and fundamentally writing to the database should still remain in PHP, because it's a PHP application. If all of a sudden you're saying, hey, we should use JavaScript to write to the database directly, that's Node. That's a completely different system.
Or you mix the two and then it becomes a nightmare.
Yeah, you don't want a hybrid solution. I think one reason React is so popular within the WordPress ecosystem is React is a really, really good UI framework. It handles a great amount of leverage over what visually comes out. And that's kind of the mentality that people need to take with JavaScript and WordPress, is that PHP is not going anywhere. JavaScript's really just to display data in a more functional capacity, or grab data from other places and maybe display that data. But ultimately, the framework, the platform, isn't really going anywhere as far as the language it's built in. So the question then becomes, how do you make it better without it being something completely different, right? So developers can come into WordPress right now, and if they're unhappy with the back end of it, as much as they can say, hey, I wish this worked more like Laravel, they could just go pick up Laravel instead, right? Like, there's nothing keeping them to WordPress besides maybe the potential of the CMS. But from a developer point of view only, there's no real need to recreate WordPress to be Laravel, because Laravel is already out there. It's open source framework already out there. So I don't know. The thought process behind that whole thing is interesting. And yeah, I mean, if I were to answer the question I posed, if WordPress was rebuilt, what would I want out of it? I want something that was a little bit more robust on the inside, the engine a little bit stronger. And I'm not saying that it's bad. I love WordPress. It's how I make a living. But maybe if it was rebuilt with some capacity better, right? And it can be, it's not just can it be. It should be a slow process, right? It shouldn't be something that happens overnight. Like, hey, tomorrow we're gonna create a pull request that's just gonna have the whole thing rebuilt. We need to slowly look at what all the pieces are, and then find out the best way to ultimately convert each piece slowly, and then test them to make sure that they're not breaking anything, right? So it's all kind of reiterates from Ryan's talk about this whole process.
I agree with Roy. As a developer, obviously, I mean, most of my writing is based around this idea that you can build more robust things on top of WordPress, but it would be much better if it was all already there. And then the main complaint that I get about my writing is that I'm creating what you call an abstraction, which is just an extra layer of code over stuff that WordPress already does just to make it more robust. But that's kind of what you have to do when like the guts are a bit older, right? You need to add that layer there, because that's what makes it robust. Like that's what increases the robustness, because since the insides aren't robust, you have to make sure that you control what makes it to the inside so that there's less problems.
Yeah, but again, going back to that slides, particularly at Ryan's talk, which I forgot the slide, it was like 40 something. The process from going to creating this better WordPress is step one: create that abstraction layer, create that abstract layer, right? Then test it, and then the abstract layer becomes the fundamental layer. Like as soon as you've tested the abstraction layer, slide 43. So if you check out Ryan's talk, or you just want to look at his slides, which I'll link to, slide 43. So basically going where you have abstraction layer, test the abstraction layer, right? So, but once it's tested and proven, make the abstraction layer the core layer. So make what WordPress needs to continue running backwards compatibility, make that the abstraction layer, right? So as soon as you have something built better, right? So at first you're building, let's take his example, WP insert post, which is a good example. Have it run an abstraction layer, right? Test it. And then all of a sudden, developers will start using what that calls. So that abstraction layer becomes the core. And now WP insert post is actually a function that sits as an abstraction layer to the fundamental core instead. A lot of that could be you could dig even deeper, right? You could say ultimately almost all of that's still an abstraction layer on WPDB, right? Because that's ultimately what calls the database. But from a theme developer, from a mid-level to low to mid-level developer point of view, if you had a great layer, right, which gets created currently, like right now would be created as an abstract layer on top of what WordPress already does. And then you said, okay, here's a rudimentary functional function, right, that does what you're expecting it to do, WP insert post, and we see that works well and doesn't break anything, then this new abstract layer, which is now a much better, more robust modular code base, becomes the fundamental core, right? It becomes core WordPress. And then WP insert post is actually a function that lives in the abstract. It is on that, now that becomes the abstraction layer. And I think if people thought about it that way, which I didn't really see it, like I saw the abstraction layer and then I was like, okay, what's next after that? You can't just say, okay, now the abstraction layer becomes core, and we'll forget about all these other functions that used to exist. But if abstraction layer became core, but all these functions are actually now, you're reversing the roles of that.
Yeah.
And it's super
Exactly.
confusing. To simplify this whole thing, just watch Ryan's talk because he makes it a little more simple, and he has slides and diagrams and all that. So it might make, yeah, it's a good talk. And that's what I see. Like that's, if WordPress was rebuilt, that's what I'd want to see out of it. And again, from a enterprise level point of view, you take that and you mix it with something like an LTS strategy. I think enterprise would have much less reason to, or sorry, the mitigation. You'd mitigate the risk for enterprise level, right? So Josh, during his keynote at LoopCon, said one of the main reasons enterprise level don't use WordPress is because, once there's a lot of risk factors involved, security being one of them, maintenance, all that kind of stuff. And it's hard to say to an enterprise level team, right? Hey, yeah, you have core developers out. There's a huge community around WordPress, so don't worry about it being updated. It's going to get updated. But because of the way the versions are and the way that it changes so rapidly, right? There's not these like long-term things. There's a lot of risk involved. So enterprise level people would rather just kind of build their own, either roll their own CMS for whatever purpose, or find some other company that is large, like Adobe, which has a CMS solution, and integrate that instead. And they spend a lot more money for that, ultimately. Like you could come in as a WordPress developer and say, hey, I can do the same thing for half the price, but the price has nothing to do with it. It's all about the risk that's involved on the back end. And a much more modular system that has an LTS strategy, I think could be the solution that really brings WordPress higher up and allows for higher up development to be had, or for like enterprise level to take it seriously, but without mitigating the low level developer or mid level developer who still wants to, code websites for, their clientele. I think that it allows you to have kind of one platform that does the range a lot better. Right now, WordPress has that range. Like you go to any WordPress conference and you'll see developers and what they're doing with WordPress on all the levels, from simple SMB or even personal websites up to enterprise. But there's a lot of weight on the bottom end of it, and it should be more evenly distributed. And it can be if we had a better solution for them. I don't really know what else to say about the subject. I think we hit on some really good points. So yeah, I mean, is there anything you guys want to add to this whole conversation? Like,
No, I feel we've kind of been the horse at this point, at least on the developer LTS, like moving away from a lot of the legacy code base problems, which again, I think that's the important discussion to have out of this, is just what do we need to do? I think in many respects, the fact that the REST API made it into core is a monumental achievement. Just in the context of adding something that is not legacy into WordPress, I think it's the largest developer feature added in a long time. And it gives me faith that we might be able to do more in the future, as long as, people like Ryan McHugh don't get burnt out with the process, which can be pretty heavy-handed, as some of you may know. Yeah, I'd love that. I'd love to see more of that coming in.
Yeah, and I'm not saying it's going to happen. Any of this is going to happen overnight, and it's kind of our responsibility. Maybe not our responsibilities here on this podcast, but it should be. And people that are either getting paid to contribute to core or have the luxury of the free time to commit to core, already part of their kind of routine. I think it's on them and on us to push that way as developers, and to make it kind of take it. And Brian said this in his talk. Take it back to the developers. Like WordPress is focused almost all, if not all of its years and all of its time on the users, right? UX has been a very, very big part of WordPress, and that's great. It's got a great backend. People love using the CMS. Adding in plugins and themes is now super easy. So you can build, a user can build something very quickly with WordPress, and that's kind of been the whole point. Not since the REST API has there been a big shift for the developer user experience, as he called it. And I think that that's where we need to shift now and focus on that. And I know that there's a lot of politics and stuff kind of looming over that, which we can't get into. But, potentially if we can break through a lot of that and say, hey, this is what we want, and maybe even build it as a fundamental showcase. Like if people actually spent the time and actually built something and said, hey, here's a prototype for what we're envisioning, that could potentially turn into something that could lead somewhere. And I know there's people who built frameworks and abstraction layers and all that, but if we were all to combine forces and say, here's what we all want to work on, here's one abstraction layer which we think could turn into, what WordPress core can be, I don't know. I think there's some potential there. Having one-off developers say, hey, we should integrate my framework is not going to do anything. But if all developers got together and said, hey, here's a united framework which we want to integrate into core and eventually make core. And there's a whole bunch of positives and pros that I'm not getting into. But here's something that we developers want, and it should be there without breaking backwards compatibility, and it still allows people to download a zip file and be up and running in 5 minutes, then I think that is where we need to aim.
Victory.
Yeah, that is victory. For those of you who that are watching, please subscribe to us on YouTube and follow us on our website. We do now have a store. So if you wanted to buy some cool swag from the WP crowd, there's a store or a shop on our website. Yeah, there is cardboard stuff on there, which is pretty sweet, if I may say so myself. There is swag related to our secondary series, which we run actually, WP Life. I got to wear my first WP Life shirt at LoopConf, which was pretty exciting. I was very happy about that. And the only other thing I want to point out is on Sundays, we run an open mastermind group. So we had our first session last Sunday. I was sitting in front of a pretty classy fireplace at the LoopConf Hotel. But if you don't know what the mastermind group is, it's basically a way to come and learn from other developers. There's no speaker, no topic. We try to encourage you to create goals for yourself for the week. And if you have any problems or any issues that come up, the developers who are on will spend time and try to debug or fix or help you out with your issues. So that's it from us. Thank you for joining. Thank you for listening. I will see you guys all next week.